Thanks very much for that excellent presentation. At this point, we'll proceed into the Q&A portion of the program. With that, we've got a lot of good questions, so let's dive right in. Our first question asks, what translation process do you use?
Casey, you want to discuss that?
Sure, Sean, I'll go ahead and take that one. And I think Carlos spoke quite a bit about this, and he mentioned really the importance of doing translation in country whenever possible, using people who are familiar with the culture and the language. That's extremely important because you have to have the meaning correctly translated. It's not enough just to do a literal translation that is often misinterpreted in country and within cultures. So whenever possible, have somebody from within the country itself, and especially somebody who's familiar with the content and concepts that you were trying to train so that they understand the meaning, because the meaning is really the most important part of that translation process.
Our next question asks, there are many excellent virtual classroom platforms like this one when used as a classroom. Do you have any additional comments on using virtual platforms for training internationally?
Yeah, this is Sean. I'll start with that, and David, feel free to jump in. In looking at the questions that came through, a lot of people asked, well, doesn't e-learning or virtual training address many of these challenges? And it can, particularly some of the physical logistics challenges that Graham talked about in terms of getting from country to country. Train strikes, rail strikes, et cetera, are eliminated if you are dealing with virtual training. But for every solution that a e-learning training brings, it may open up some other challenges related to the data privacy issues. Internet access is not the same in all countries around the world, the speeds at which your people can access it. So I think what's really important when you look at e-learning or virtual training is to make sure you've not just said, well, we've solved many of the hurdles. Make sure that you're then addressing the other challenges that we articulated today, whether that's legal compliance, technical capacity, et cetera. David, any take on that?
Yeah, Sean, I thought you did a real nice job summing up pieces of that. The only couple of things that I'd add to that is if you take a look with the virtual training and the e-learning training, so many of the content pieces that we discussed about here today, the need for localization elements, the need for proper translations, the need to be culturally adapted, all those things hold true regardless of the delivery method that you opt to use. And one of the other things that you need to consider specific to the question about virtual training, I know from personal experience about 4 or 5 months ago, I was up delivering a training program sometime between 12 and 3 in the morning here Mountain Time in order to hit a specific time zone need in the Asia-Pacific region. So even though the electronic pieces of the training can certainly bring some solutions around automation and some logistics, they do also definitely present some of their own, as John was talking about a second ago.
Okay, our next question asks, how do you validate your instruments across cultures?
I'll take that one, Sean. The first and foremost thing to do when you're doing this is to make sure, once again, it goes back to the translation process. So if you make sure that you have a very good process for translating your materials and you're confident that the meaning of those materials is going to be well understood in the countries that you're working with, that is 90% of the battle of validating your tools and instruments across cultures. Beyond that, if you want to be more scientific about it, there are many types of statistical analyses that you can run to make sure that your instruments, particularly assessments, are valid across cultures. And earlier I spoke about the International Test Commission. If you look at their materials, they're very specific about the types of statistical analyses that you should run in order to ensure validity.
Okay, our next question asks, is the concept of European learning, i.e. making mistakes, experiment with behavior, challenging your peers, feedback as a means to change a communication climate, etc., applicable in all cultures, or do we have to consider a completely different learning concept?
Well, that is a tough question, but an interesting one. And Casey, I think you may have some thoughts on this as well. But as Casey mentioned earlier, and as Carlos mentioned earlier, the culture of a country can vary dramatically, and so the idea that trial and error being applicable may in fact be much more appropriate in certain countries or certain regions of the world, such as Europe or the United States, than it would in places such as Asia or in Latin and South America, certainly. Casey, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with that. I'll add to it. I think that it's both, actually. You absolutely have to take local culture into account. Otherwise, these things won't be understood or accepted in the countries that you're working in. So you have to recognize that, and it has to be on the table. However, there is another aspect to that, which is the culture of the organization or company itself. And organizations do have their own cultures, and they create those cultures. So as long as they're clear about what their own concepts are, what their own cultural standards are, and what expectations are within that organization or company, then they can clearly communicate that also through such things as training programs. So it's really both. You do have to take the local culture into account, but the organizational culture is also very important.
One great point made by one of our participants today from UK, I believe, was that what we've talked about has tended to sound like corporate pushing out training content throughout the world. But in fact, many organizations and some of our clients have found that by picking and choosing elements developed in local countries and then bringing those to other parts of their organization worldwide, they can find out what has worked in a local market, whether that's a managerial skills training class or something more tactical, to take those locally driven initiatives and then turn them globally. Both makes the local markets buy into the whole program, knowing that they've had a chance to affect training at the global or certainly international level. And also, you then get the efficiencies of not having to necessarily drive everything from corporate at the origination perspective, but finding the pieces that have made a difference in local best practices and then take advantage of your global training infrastructure.
Our next question asks, any suggestions on how to find good local vendors for technical content and delivery?
I'll take a stab at that, Sean. So if you look at finding good local content, good vendor for deliveries, and I'll talk about this in a global context, I think it's absolutely important that you do your homework up front. And so doing your homework up front really involves two things. One, clearly understanding what your goals and objectives are, and then understanding what your vendor's capabilities are. So for example, if you're looking at a program in a particular region of the world where you're trying to address a specific leadership challenge or communication challenge, team training, or even much more technical content, it's a relatively easy task to find the vendor in that local market that can assist you. If, as you're doing that, you need to begin thinking about, is this really just a one-time event or a one-time experience, or is this something that has the possibility to grow beyond that, either to a regional experience or perhaps a global experience? Those initial vendors that you choose can have a great deal of impact on your success to be able to take something from a local market and to take it more collaboratively globally. So I'd very strongly encourage that you do your homework up front, understanding from an organizational perspective what this is. And then as we talked about in the webinar, I'd very clearly articulate the questions and answers that you need to get before you can actually pick and choose a partner.
Yeah, and this may be a case of collaborating with your local operational folks, and whether they've done training in a local country before or not, there may be vendors or partners that they've used who can, if you're going into Romania, for example, you may never have done training there, but your operations folks may know people in that. And there is a bit of trial and error, but don't feel that those of us sitting here in the U.S. will always find the best answer when it comes to what will work in a more remote geography.